Colonel Renata Aldecott stood at attention in a dress uniform that suddenly felt too heavy for her shoulders, watching the flag fold into its triangle for the last time in her career, when the doors at the back of the auditorium opened, and every sound in the room simply stopped. I didn't hear the doors first. I felt them. A change in the air, the way you feel a storm before you see the clouds. 300 people had gone quiet at once, and quiet like that doesn't happen by accident. I kept my eyes forward, the way 30 years of discipline had trained me to, because that's what you do when you're standing at the front of a retirement ceremony that is supposed to be the last formal thing you ever do in uniform. You don't turn around. You don't break bearing. But Delia broke first. I saw it in the corner of my eye, my oldest friend, a woman who had pulled shrapnel out of her own leg without flinching, pressing a hand flat against her mouth like she was trying to hold something in that had already gotten loose. Then I heard my daughter say one word. Not Mom. Not a gasp. Just, Dad. But let me take you back. Because you can't understand what that doorway did to me unless you understand what the 6 years before it had cost. I met Theo Aldecott when I was 22 and still convinced the army was something I was doing until I figured out my real life. He was a second lieutenant with a laugh too big for briefing rooms, and a habit of drawing tiny cartoons in the margins of after-action reports, which should have gotten him in more trouble than it did. We married at 25, in a courthouse, because neither of us wanted to wait for a chapel to be free. Mara came 2 years later, loud from her first breath, and stayed loud in all the ways that made our quarters feel less like army housing and more like a home that happened to move every 3 years. We built a marriage the way you build anything under deployment schedules, in fragments. 6 months here. 8 months there. Video calls at 3 a.m., because the time zones didn't care about anyone's sleep. It wasn't easy, but it was ours. Theo used to say we weren't good at being apart, we were just good at coming back together, and for 18 years he was right every single time. He made Major the same year I made Lieutenant Colonel. We threw a party in our backyard in Georgia with a cheap grill and cheaper beer, and Mara, 16 and mortified by both of us, took a photo that's still the background on my phone. I didn't know it then, but that photo is the last one where all 3 of us are standing in the same frame, unbroken. 3 months later, Theo was assigned to a joint task force operation with a classification level high enough that he couldn't tell me the country, let alone the mission. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the tightness in his voice on our last call. A tightness I told myself was just fatigue. If anything ever seems strange, he said, trust Delia before you trust the paperwork. I laughed it off. Told him not to be dramatic 4 days before a deployment. I have replayed that call more times than I can count. Turning his words over like a stone, I keep expecting to feel different. 2 weeks later, 2 men in dress uniforms stood on my porch, and Mara, 18 years old and home for winter break, watched her mother's knees give out on the front steps before either of them said a single word. They didn't need to. I already knew what that uniform, at that hour, at my door meant. Major Theo Aldecott, they told me, had been killed during a classified extraction operation. No further details could be provided. His remains, they said, were not recoverable. I planned a funeral around an empty casket. I told my daughter, over and over, in every way I knew how, that her father had died doing something brave, even though I was never allowed to know what that something was. I did not know, standing at that grave, that 6 years later I would be standing in a different room, in a different uniform, watching that same man walk through a door like grief itself had gotten something catastrophically wrong. The morning after the notification, I woke up before the alarm out of habit, reached across the bed the way I had for 18 years, and found nothing but cold sheets and a silence so complete it had a weight to it. That silence became the architecture of my life for the next 6 years. I built everything around its shape. Mara deferred her second semester of college without asking me, which I only found out about when the tuition refund hit our joint account. She said she wasn't going to leave me alone in that house with a folded flag on the mantel and a closet full of a dead man's uniforms. I didn't have the strength to argue with her. Some nights I was grateful for her stubbornness. Other nights, watching her put her own life on hold for my grief, I hated myself for needing her to. The army gave me exactly what it gives every widow, a chaplain's visit, A casualty assistance officer named Captain Reyes who was kind in the practice way of someone who'd delivered this same script 100 times, and a folder of paperwork thick enough to make loss feel administrative. Death benefits. Survivor annuities. A form for the flag. A form for the medals awarded posthumously, including one I'd never heard of before. A joint service commendation with a citation so vague it could have described anything from a supply run to a firefight. What operation was this for? I asked Reyes, tapping the citation. That information isn't releasable, ma'am, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Classified at a level above what I have access to. I remember thinking, even through the fog of that first month, that it was strange for a posthumous commendation to stay classified from the widow it was meant to honor. But grief doesn't leave much room for suspicion. It fills every available space with itself. Delia was the one who kept me upright those first years, in the literal sense. Showing up at 6 a.m. some mornings just to sit on my porch with 2 coffees and not say anything at all, because she understood that silence shared was different from silence alone. She'd served 2 rotations with Theo before I ever met her, and grief made her sharper instead of softer. I noticed, in year 2, that she'd started asking odd questions whenever Theo's old unit came up in conversation, who had signed off on personnel movements, who had reviewed casualty reports, whether I'd ever gotten a full briefing on the operation itself. You're doing that thing, I told her once, where you sound like you're building a file on something. She didn't deny it. She just said, some things don't add up, Bren. I've seen Kia reports before. I've never seen one this clean. I didn't push her. I couldn't. Some part of me understood that if I let myself start pulling at threads, I would have to relive that porch, that folded flag, that grave all over again. And I didn't have anything left to rebuild myself with a second time. So I did what I'd always done. I worked. I threw myself into logistics command with the kind of focus that either heals you or hides you. And I never fully figured out which one it was doing to me. I made Colonel. I raised my daughter, who grew from a devastated 18-year-old into a sharp, guarded 24-year-old with her father's laugh buried somewhere she rarely let it out anymore. I kept Theo's uniforms in the closet for 4 years before I could finally box them up. And even then, I couldn't make myself give away the one with his name tape still stitched crooked over the pocket, the way he always wore it. There were small things over the years that I noticed and set aside without letting myself look at them directly. A change of address form in our old joint file that I never remembered filing, dated 8 months after his death. A yearly letter that arrived every spring from a family support liaison office. I'd never heard mentioned in any of Reyes's briefings, addressed not to me, but to Mara. I asked her about it once, and she went quiet in a way that made me not ask again. It's nothing, Mom, she said. Just some support program thing. I write back sometimes. It helps. I told myself grief makes people do private things to survive it, and that my daughter's version of that was harmless. I told myself a lot of things in those 6 years that let me keep standing upright. The retirement ceremony was supposed to be the last chapter. 30 years closed clean, folded into a flag of my own this time instead of his. I remember thinking, 3 days before, that I finally felt something close to peace. I did not know that Delia had spent that final week making one more call to a records office she'd been quietly petitioning for 18 months. I did not know that a package addressed to her, marked personal, had arrived the morning of the ceremony containing a redacted casualty report with one line that hadn't been blacked out completely. I did not know that the door at the back of that auditorium was about to open on 6 years of a truth I had been standing next to the entire time without ever being allowed to see it. The reception after the ceremony didn't happen the way it was supposed to. There was no cake, no toasts, no folded flag handed over with a handshake and a photograph. There was a private room the base commander cleared in about 90 seconds flat, and there was me, sitting across a folding table from a man I had buried, unable to make my hands stop shaking long enough to hold the coffee someone had put in front of me. Teotonka. I don't remember all of it. Grief and shock do something to memory, blur it at the edges like a photograph left too long in the sun, but I remember the shape of what he said. Captured during the extraction. Held for 11 months in conditions he wouldn't describe with Mara down the hall. Recovered through a channel the army didn't want on any public record. because acknowledging his recovery meant acknowledging the operation had gone wrong in ways that pointed back at decisions made 2 ranks above his own. They told me you'd been briefed, he said. That there was a process. That I couldn't make contact until the debrief and reintegration period cleared, for my own protection and yours. For 6 years. I fought it every month, Ren. I have the letters I wasn't allowed to send. His voice cracked on that last part, and for the first time since the doorway, I saw the man I married instead of the ghost I'd been staring at. I believed him. That was almost the hardest part. I believed every word, and I was still furious, because belief and forgiveness are not the same animal. And grief doesn't care how good your reasons were for making it last 6 years too long. It was Delia who put the second piece on the table, literally, in a manila folder she'd been sitting on through the entire ceremony. The redacted casualty report. Most of it blacked out in the standard way, except for one line near the bottom that the redaction software had missed by a single character. A case number that matched a joint operations review file she'd found through a friend in records who owed her a favor from another lifetime. This case number, she said, isn't filed under casualty assistance. It's filed under an internal review board. Ren, someone reviewed what happened to Theo. Someone signed off on how it got reported. And it wasn't Reyes's office. I asked the only question that mattered. Who signed it? She turned the folder around. A name, unredacted, sat at the bottom of an authorization line. Major General Corwin Blake. I knew the name. Everyone in Logistics Command knew the name. Blake was 2 years from a 4th star. A man whose career had been built on the reputation of never having a single operation under his oversight go publicly wrong. I'd shaken his hand at exactly the kind of ceremony I'd just walked out of. Mara found us an hour later, and when she saw the folder, something in her face changed in a way that told me she already knew more than she'd ever said out loud. The family support liaison, she said quietly. The letters I've been writing back to for 2 years. I need to show you something. She pulled up an email chain on her phone. Years of correspondence with an anonymous liaison contact, careful and warm, always signed only with initials. Questions about how she was doing in school. Small updates about ongoing casework. She'd never questioned because grief makes you grateful for anyone who remembers to ask how you're holding up. In the very last message, sent the morning of the ceremony, the liaison had written 4 words she hadn't understood until now. Today, everything gets easier. They knew, Mara said. Someone in that office knew this whole time, and they were managing me instead of telling me. That night, Delia tracked down a name we hadn't had before. A retired sergeant named Foss who'd worked communications on the extraction, and had left the service quietly 18 months after it happened, faster than his contract required. She found him through a veterans network group, and when Delia called, he didn't ask who she was before he said, I wondered when someone would finally call about this. He agreed to talk. Not on the phone. In person, and only once. We drove 2 hours the next morning, the 3 of us. Me, Delia, Theo staying behind at Mara's insistence, because she said rightly, that I needed to hear this without also managing his guilt in real time. Foss met us at a diner outside of town, a private journal in a shoebox on the seat beside him, pages of handwritten notes he'd kept because he said, I didn't trust anyone to remember it right unless I wrote it down myself. He told us about a mission that had gone outside its authorized parameters. An extraction team caught in a position command had been warned about and dismissed. He told us Theo hadn't died in that operation, he'd been captured, and command had known within 72 hours. He told us the Kia report had been drafted and approved before confirmation of death had ever been established, because a confirmed Kia closed a review file faster and quieter than an open MIA case with hard questions attached to it. And he told us who approved the report for filing, in writing, over his own objection. Blake's name again. This time with Foss willing to say it on record. I drove back to base that night with the folder on my lap, and a decision already forming that had nothing left in it of grief, and everything in it of the discipline 30 years in uniform had built into me. This wasn't going to be a quiet conversation over coffee. I was going to make General Blake explain himself in a room where he couldn't control who else was listening. The review board convened 11 days later, in a room with better lighting than it deserved for what was about to happen inside it. I hadn't gone through informal channels. Delia had warned me that a quiet complaint would get quietly buried by the same machinery that had buried Theo for 6 years. So instead I'd requested a formal Inspector General inquiry and made certain, through channels of my own built over 30 years of favors owed and given, that the request landed on desks that couldn't simply lose it in routing. Foss agreed to submit his journal as part of the record. Delia's redacted report went in alongside it. Mara's email correspondence, time-stamped and complete, went in as well, because she'd insisted on that herself. He doesn't get to manage me anymore either, she'd said, and I'd never been prouder of my daughter than in that sentence. Blake sat across the table with the calm of a man who had spent 30 years believing his calm was the same thing as being right. He was courteous. He used my rank when he addressed me, which was its own kind of insult. A reminder that he still thought of this as something happening between colleagues instead of something that had cost me 6 years I would never get back. Colonel Aldecott, he said, I understand this has been an extraordinarily difficult personal situation, but operational security decisions of this nature are made to protect. You signed a false casualty report, I said. My husband was alive, and you let me bury an empty casket. The extraction operation exceeded its authorized scope, he said, choosing each word with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this. Acknowledging Major Aldecott's status as a prisoner rather than deceased would have required disclosing the operation's parameters, which were never approved above my level. A confirmed casualty closed the incident without further exposure. It was, at the time, judged the responsible course. Responsible to whom? He didn't answer that one. I hadn't expected him to. Foss's journal did more work in that room than I could have. Written in real time, contemporaneous, with dates and objections logged the same week they'd happened. It wasn't a grieving widow's accusation. It was a paper trail Blake himself had inadvertently helped create by trying to make everything look procedurally clean. The redaction that had slipped by one character did the rest. And Mara's emails, calm and unemotional on the page, made it plain that someone in Blake's chain had spent 2 years managing a 22-year-old woman's grief like a liability to be contained rather than a person to be told the truth. Sumner, my own commanding officer, who I hadn't known was quietly gathering his own information those 11 days, produced one more document. Internal correspondence showing Blake had been informed of Theo's status alive in custody within 72 hours of the failed extraction. A full 2 weeks before my porch, before those 2 men in dress uniforms, before the funeral with the empty casket. Blake's calm didn't break, not exactly. But something in his voice changed when he said, quietly, mostly to the record and not to me, I made a determination that served the larger operational picture. You made a determination that served your promotion file, Sumner said. And it was the first time in 11 days anyone in that room had said the true thing plainly instead of in the language everyone had been trained to use instead. The board didn't reach a verdict that day. These things take time, more time than any of us wanted to give it after everything time had already stolen. But I watched something happen to Blake in that room that I recognized, because I'd worn a version of it myself for 6 years. The particular stillness of a person watching a story they've told so long they'd started to believe it, come apart in front of witnesses who weren't going to let it be quietly rebuilt. 3 weeks later, the finding came through. Formal reprimand. Referral for further review by a board with authority to recommend separation. Early retirement, effective immediately, in lieu of a court-martial that would have made public exactly what he'd spent 6 years keeping private. It wasn't everything. Foss told us, over pie we barely touched at that same diner, that men like Blake rarely lose everything, only the parts of everything that had let them believe they were untouchable. I understood that. I'd stopped needing him destroyed somewhere around the point in that hearing where I'd watched Mara read her own emails into the record in a voice that didn't shake. What I needed, it turned out, was smaller and harder to get from an institution. I needed to go home and figure out how to be married to a man I'd buried. The hardest conversation wasn't the one with Blake. It was the one I had with Theo 3 nights after the hearing closed, sitting on the back steps of a house he'd never lived in, because we'd moved twice since the funeral, and he'd been a stranger to every address I'd called home since. I don't know how to just pick back up, I told him. I'm not the woman you left. I built a whole life around you being gone. I don't know what parts of it I'm supposed to take apart now. I don't want you to take anything apart, he said. I just want a chance to be in the life you built, not replace it. It wasn't a fix. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one are too often told as if love alone dissolves 6 years of stolen time. And it doesn't. There were nights I looked at him across the dinner table and felt grief instead of relief. Grief for the years neither of us would ever get back. Grief for a version of Mara's 20s that had been spent grieving a father who wasn't gone. There were nights Theo woke from something he never fully described and sat alone in the kitchen until morning. Carrying 11 months I would never be able to reach no matter how much I loved him. But there were other nights too. The first time he laughed, really laughed, the too big laugh from his lieutenant days. At something small and stupid Mara said at dinner, I cried in the bathroom afterward, not from sadness, just from the strange, disorienting relief of hearing a sound I'd thought I would only ever have on an old phone recording. Mara took the longest to let herself trust it. She'd spent 2 years writing careful, guarded letters to a liaison she now knew had been managing her grief instead of honoring it. And that kind of betrayal doesn't heal on anyone else's timeline. She went to therapy on her own, without either of us asking her to, and one evening, months later, she showed up at the house with her father's old cartoon margined after-action reports. The ones I'd kept in a box in the attic, and asked him to teach her to draw the same badly drawn little tanks he used to sketch in his own. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was smaller than that, and somehow more durable. A decision to build something new next to the wreckage instead of waiting for the wreckage to disappear. I retired, for real this time, 6 months later than planned, in a ceremony with no surprises at the door. Delia stood beside me in her dress uniform. The same friend who had spent 6 years quietly refusing to accept a story that didn't add up. And when they handed me my flag, I folded my hand over hers instead of the fabric, because I understood by then which parts of those 30 years actually mattered. Theo stood in the third row, in the same suit that still didn't quite fit him. And when I looked up from the podium, he wasn't a ghost this time. He was just a man, imperfect and late in mine, watching his wife close a chapter that had almost closed without him in it. I think about General Blake sometimes, in the ordinary, unremarkable retirement he negotiated for himself, and I feel less anger than I expected to. What I feel instead is a kind of clarity. That institutions protect themselves by teaching good people to believe silence is the same thing as service. And that the only cure for that is people willing to keep pulling at a thread, even when everyone around them insists it's better left alone. 6 years is a long time to grieve a lie. But it turns out 6 years is not too long to start telling the truth instead. If you're willing to do the harder work of actually living inside it once you have. That's the story. Theo and I aren't the same people who married at 25 in a courthouse with no time to wait for a chapel. But we're still here, still choosing each other. On the other side of something that tried to make sure we never would.